Welcome, welcome to the Elokus podcast, and this is class number 7 in the discourse Naso Rosh, which is the fourth discourse in the great book, Dimu 5672. Okay, we're holding over here in chapter 12. See how it goes today. We might be able to conclude chapter 12. So, as we've been learning in the last few classes, what he's developed very strongly is that a proof that we have to say that even the oiros, even the lights of Atzilus, are not purely and absolutely infinite and pashut, because the last proof that he's been developing in the last thing is that because the kalim of Atzilus, the vessels of Atzilus, definitely are limited. Either they're limited in the sense that there's a full limitation, that they limit even the expression of the spheros in Atzilus, in the world of Atzilus, that there's some level of gavul to the expression, of limitation, to the kindness, to all the forces of Atzilus. Or even if we say it's only kayach hagvul, as we explained in various opinions, and in Atzilus itself, it doesn't really limit the light because it's still a force. It releases a force that's limitless even in Atzilus. However, or at least in Atzilus, that does not take away from the gavul of the kalim. Why? For two reasons. One reason is the very idea that it gives character to the light and differentiating character. That means before the spheroids, the light is not kindness, it's not gavura, it's not this, it's not that, it's just a simple light. And then once it goes into the kalim and the vessels, it becomes chesed, gavura, teferes, and all these various different things. That's already, of course, showing on a limitation. And also in terms of the quantity as well, although in Atzilus it pumps still infinite kindness, but the fact that very kindness, when it will travel further into the lower worlds, is already reduced and not in its state of infinity, as we know that the lights of Atzilus do not flow into the lower worlds, do not manifest in their infinite state in the lower realms. That's a sign that they are already limited, as we discussed yesterday, even in Atzilus itself. And the rare cases, I'm just doing a brief review of what we learned yesterday, the rare cases in which the light of Atzilus does flood into the lower worlds in a manner that it reveals itself in its infinity to the lower worlds, like by Kriyas Yamsuf, by the splitting of the sea, or when a unique soul comes into the lower world and it's a soul of Atzilus, that requires a power that's above Atzilus to do that, above like the eastern wind that was blowing by the time the splitting of the sea, but not from within the power of Atzilus itself, which shows us that Atzilus is limited. If that's the case, that means that the vessels are limited. And if the vessels are limited, they can only withstand somewhat of a limited light. If the light that would be manifesting in the vessels would be utterly infinite, then the vessels could not absorb them and limit them. And this is all a proof. This is the idea that he's trying to prove in this chapter, that the or, even the or that becomes an or pnimi, becomes an internal light, is not the releasing of or ein sof in its pure state. Now there is such a thing. That's the or makif. The encompassing lights, they are released as they are, and they are really, really pashut. They're really simple and they're utterly infinite. But the or pnimi, the light, the internal light, which we're soon going to see, is a derivative from the kav, which is that thread of light, which has its own origination in Atzmos, in the essence of God. And it's not just a revelation of Atzmos as Atzmos is for himself, the essence of God as God is, but rather it has to do, as we're going to see later, with the Eser Spheres Hagnuzos, with the 10 powers of attributes that are hidden in all the way up into in the Or Ein Sof, and that's the origins of the Or Pnimi. So from its very, very, very get-go, when it's released in its very, very quintessential origin, it's never really the pure power of the Or Ein Sof. It is already a mitigated to whatever degree level of light, and that's why when it makes its way into Atzilus, it is a restrainable light, and it is a calable light. It is possible to take it into vessels. That's the idea of where this whole Maamor is going, and as we said, this is going to be developed still over the next course of a few discourses, where this is the whole idea to explain us what Or Pnimi means. Now, Or Pnimi is targeted to a recipient, and if it's targeted to a recipient, it has some breaks to it already. It has some infrastructure to the light. That's what he was explaining over here. Now, he's going to challenge this notion. The whole proof that he just gave was that a finite vessel cannot facilitate an infinite light. So that forces us to say that the light is not truly infinite to the full meaning of the word. That's the point, right? So he's going to challenge that. He's going to ask a question. What's the question? The challenge is going to be from something we've learned already. We've learned at the beginning of the vessels, remember those, go back to the earlier discourses, we were learning that the origins of the vessels of Atzilus are from the Oisias Harishimu. Remember we learned the vessels are a product of the Tzimtzum. What does the Tzimtzum do? What does the contraction do? The lights are a product of the Oir HaKav, of the revelation. But the vessels, because again, the spheres have lights and vessels. The lights are a derivative of the revelation of Hashem, and the vessels are a derivative, and they come from the constriction of Hashem, the Tzimtzum. And we learned that what did the Tzimtzum do? The Tzimtzum highlighted and made us notice the Oisias Harishimu. These are the hidden letters that are in the Or Ein Sof. Remember the tray after when there was a Tzimtzum, what was left over were these letters. Like when you erase a paper, we said there is still a traceable traces from leftover. What was left over was these letters that were once in the Or Ein Sof, but when they were in the Or Ein Sof, they were not noticed. They were flooded by the Or Ein Sof. And now the Tzimtzum, by hiding the infinite light, gave expression and made the letters of the Rishimu be noticeable, be recognizable, and that's the power which create all like a letter. A letter is a contained entity. It's a certain shape. It's a certain form. It has every letter is different than the other. So this is the very origins of letters, which is really the origins of the Kalim. That's what we learned. So he's going to ask a question. Comes out according to this that the letters of the Rishimu are the source of the Kalim, which means they're the vessels. That means they are an inyan of Gevul. They are a concept. They are a limitation. Yet we know that these Oisias Harishimu were a long time ago, before the Tzimtzum. Where were they? They were swimming in the Or Ein Sof. On the Or Ein Sof, and these letters were perfectly fine living together. The Or Ein Sof was flooding the letters. The letters were embedded in the Or Ein Sof. And if we're going to make the argument that we've been arguing right now, that finite vessels cannot withstand truly infinite light, the Or Ein Sof that's before the Tzimtzum, that was revealed everywhere before the Tzimtzum, that Or Ein Sof, that infinite light, was real Or Ein Sof. Right? That's the Or Ein Sof, real Or Ein Sof, real limitless light. And yet we have spoken that there are Oisias Harishimu that are there. And the Oisias are in the midst of the Or Ein Sof. And the Or Ein Sof is revealing itself in those Oisias. Because it doesn't say anywhere that the Oisias were not anything apart from the Or Ein Sof. So the Or Ein Sof is revealing itself in those Oisias, in those letters. So that, how can that happen? How can limited vessels hold infinite light? It doesn't make any sense. So he's going to say it's not a question. We can't use that as a rejection of the previous argument. Why? Because he's going to give two explanations. I'm going to say them very briefly first, and then we're going to elaborate. The difference is we have to make a major difference between the Oisias Harishimu, between the letters of the Rishimu before the Tzimtzum, and the Kalim of Atzilus. Because if you remember, he doesn't bring that here, but if you remember, we mentioned this many times, the statement of the Avodas HaKodesh from where he says that the first Gevul, HaGevul HaNimtzam, he says the Or Ein Sof, the infinite light, must have a limiting power as well. The words of the Avodas HaKodesh. Just like Rameir Gabbai, right? We learned that just like he has the power of, he has the infinite power, he also has to have a power to self-limit. Right? That's what we learned. Because if we say that he's only limitless, then that itself would be a limitation on him. You are limiting his perfection. If you would, God forbid, say that he can't limit himself. Fine. So therefore we have to say that he also has a power of gvul. He's kolol. Hashem himself has within himself a koyach gvul and a koyach bli gvul, a power of limit and a power of limitlessness. And then he says, "V'hagvul animtza mimenu b'tchila." But where is the gvul, the Hashem's power of limiting? Where is it nimtza mimenu b'tchila? Where is it first seen? Where is it first observed? He says that, and that's in us the spheres of Atzilus, which means the kelim of Atzilus. That's where there is gvul, the first expression of the koyach gvul of God. So what do you see from here? What happened with the Yisroel Rishimu? The Yisroel Rishimu is far earlier. And they are already also the koyach gvul. The answer is that the letters of the Rishimu, we can't call them a koyach gvul. Why? Because they're not a koyach, they're not a power, they're not a separated power. The Yisroel Rishimu are we call them osios, we call them letters as if they are letters. There's no letters there. There's only Or Ein Sof. It's just that, what are we saying? Because the Or Ein Sof is so perfect, in his infinity, part of his infinity is that he can limit himself. But the limit, the ability to limit himself is not a distinct power of limitation. There is the limitlessness of God, which includes the power to limit. But in that level, in that stage of existence, the limiting power is of the limitlessness. It's not a separate entity. So there's no limiting kalim. There's no substance. There's no mitzius. As the words of the Rebbe over here. There's no existence of gvul in the Or Ein Sof. There is only bli gvul. You cannot in any way compare that to the vessels. The vessels are already a distinct entity with a limited form. It's already a form. It's already a limited construct that is limited. The koyach gvul has separated itself from the koyach bli gvul of Hashem. It stands now as God's particular power to be kind, God's particular power to be disciplining, to be mighty, God's particular power to be compassionate, and from that power it can only be compassionate. There's only one. It's already defined. It's a specific ethic force, a specific character. That's not in the Or Ein Sof. So the Yisroel Rishimu, it's not only that they're more subtle. It's not the same thing, but on a subtler level. It's completely different. There is no limitation there. So therefore, we will still assert ourselves, assert the argument that once you have a limited entity, a limited energy cannot host and facilitate infinite light. And that's why the vessels of Atzilus would not be able to receive Or Ein Sof. And therefore we have to say that the Or that's going into those vessels is not Or Ein Sof. Don't question that or don't object from the Yisroel Rishimu, because the Yisroel Rishimu are not limited vessels. They can't be called an existence of limitation. They are still part of the limitlessness of Hashem. They're not limited, and there's no reason for them to shatter from the infinite light because they themselves are part of the limitless light, of the infinite light. Remember, we learned that the Yisroel Rishimu before the Tzimtzum is like the engraved letters of the Luchot. Remember, we spoke about it, of the tablets, that they were engraved completely from one side to the other side, which means there's nothing other than the stone itself, implying the idea that the Yisroel Rishimu before the Tzimtzum, the Yisroel Rishimu before the letters of the Rishimu before the Tzimtzum, are part of the Ein Sof. They don't have a distinct existence for themselves. They are one with the Ein Sof, and therefore they're not limited. So the Or Ein Sof could be revealed in itself because they are one with the Ein Sof. That's his first argument. Let's learn that inside, and then we'll tackle the second argument. First, let's first see the question. It's not compared to the levels that before the tzimtzum. that which we might be able to question and ask. That within the power of Gevul, that is in the Ein Sof, Shehein, which they are Oisias Rishimu, which they are the letters of the Rishimu. It was in a full revealed way in them. The Orein Sof Abligvul, the infinite light that is limitless, was fully revealed and expressed and manifest in these osios, in these letters. This is all before the Tzimtzum. So that would seem to negate the argument that a finite vessel cannot hold infinite light. So he says you can't, that's not an argument. Why? So and that is because as follows: before the tzimtzum, before the contraction, there was no such a thing as existence. A metzios means a definable existence, a something. Now there's nothing. There's just God. There's just God's power. There's no thing, and even in the divine, there's no specific powers of Him. There's just His limitlessness. Shahare, and therefore I say, well, there were letters. Shareya oisias the Rishimu, because the letters of the Rishimu that later become more expressed as letters, but when they're before the Tzimtzum, einom bebchinas metzios oisias chas v'shalom. They're not at all in a state of an existence of letters, God forbid. Like we said earlier in chapter 10, in the Maayon of Yisroel, we discussed this. It's explained elsewhere. It's like the letters of the luchos, which the letters of the tablets are not something separated from the tablets. It's completely one with the tablets. So in this case, it would mean like this: the koyach hagvul that's in the Orein Sof, the power of gvul that's in the Orein Sof, which are the oisias harishimu, which are the letters of the traced letters. These letters before the tzimtzum, which represent the power of Hashem to limit Himself, in that stage, they are of His limitlessness. There's nothing separated. It's just one power in God. The fact that He's limitless and He has no boundaries, including that He's not. And what is the letters of the Rishimu on this level? Is expressing the idea that He is so limitless that He can limit Himself. So what is the power to limit? Part of His limitlessness, not a power that is actually limiting. The imkain. And therefore, you can't ask on this stage of existence, how was the Orein Sof revealed in them? Since everything is just Ein Sof. It's not two separate things, it's just Ein Sof. It doesn't contradict the Gevul and the Beligvul, the limiting and the limit, and the limited and the limitlessness are both the same thing, they're both limitless. This that Hashem has the power to limit, and that what is it? That He can self-limit. And the power of Gevul, as we're looking at it in this stage, who Ein Sof Mamish, is literally one and the same, and of the Ein Sof, it's literally infinite. It's like the power of God to express limitlessly. The same power is the power to express with limitation, because they're both the same idea that whatever you want, I can do. You want limitation, I give limitation. You want limitlessness, I give you limitlessness. At this point, they're not two separate things. It's all one boundlessness of Hashem. That's argument number one, why we cannot object. This would not serve, this would not negate what we said earlier. The second thing is that he's going to add, even if we would argue and say that maybe there is somewhat, even on a subtle, something of a distinct limiting entity, even if we do not consider argument number one that he just made, and we would look at these kalim, as vessels, oisios, as letters of limiting powers, it still would not be a question. Why? Because those letters were completely shut down. What we mean is they weren't in a state of expression and in a state of actualization. And therefore for all practical purposes, it's as if they don't exist. It's like the spheroids of Atzilus, the Kalim of Atzilus, are definitely in full operation. They're in full expression. They are present in Atzilus. Why are they present in Atzilus? Because they do a job on the lights. What do? They limit the lights. They take a relatively or pashut, a simple light, and they make it blue and yellow and green, all the different colors. They make it kindness, and so it taints, it gives character. Not only that, it also limits it, as we discussed earlier, how it limits the light, at least when it will go out of Atzilus. So it's functioning, it's an expression. It's highlighted, it's present, it's there. And therefore, we're saying like this: how can you stay in your expressed being, present with who you are as a defined, limited being, while the infinite light is expressed around you? You can't express both. You can't have an expression of finitude that it should be in a state of presence, in a state of actualization, while infinite energy is being actualized. It doesn't work. The two are contradiction. However, before the Tzimtzum, he says, the Orin Soif was in the Oisias Rashimu were in a deep slumber as if they don't even exist. Why? And he says an amazingly important idea. He says there is a major difference between before the Tzimtzum and after Tzimtzum in the entire dominance. See, in general, the two forces that there are in running through the entire system, the entire cosmic order, from the very quintessential beginnings of everything, the two forces are the force of revelation and the force of concealment. Tzimtzum and Giloi. These are the two forces, which is really Chesed and Gevura. These are the two main powers, revelation and concealment. Before the Tzimtzum, what was dominating fully was revelation. And that's why Orein Sof was in full expression and revelation. What happened to the power of Tzimtzum, the power of limitation? It was a non-entity. It was as if it didn't exist. And therefore, everything that comes from Tzimtzum, which begins with this, what is the origins of Tzimtzum and all of that? It's all the Oisias Arashimu. It's these limiting powers. Was completely silent. Silent to the degree that it took a back seat, but to the degree that it was like unpronounced. After the Tzimtzum, what happened? The opposite happened. The Tzimtzum overpowered the power of Gevura, the power of concealment overpowered the power of revelation. And you know what happens? The Orein Sof becomes unexpressed. And the proof to that is the Orein Sof, remember we discussed this, we mentioned this 2 classes ago. The Orein Sof that's beyond the Tzilus, we said, is everywhere. The Orein Sof is present right now wherever you are. In your body, in your car, at your computer desk. Wherever you're sitting, wherever you're walking in the park, you're listening to this, the Orein Sof is present everywhere. Yet we have no clue that he is in his full presence everywhere. Why? Because that's the Tzimtzum Arishon, the first Tzimtzum, is creating such a blockage on the Orein Sof that it's as if the Orein Sof doesn't exist. And what does exist, so much so that he says that there are levels where God is even questioned, whether God even exists. There can be such a concealment of the presence. He's everywhere and he fills the entire space of all of existence, and yet there are spaces where there is even where people can exist in an utter godless state, How's that possible? It's because of the tzimtzum. So after the tzimtzum, it's as if the Or Ein Sof, even though it's present, it's overpowered by the tzimtzum, and it becomes a non-entity. And it doesn't interfere with us. The Or Ein Sof doesn't interfere with anything that's going on in the world. So in the same way, like now, the Or Ein Sof is shut down to the point that it's non-existent, let's flip the coin the opposite. Before the tzimtzum happened, it was the opposite way. Everything that had to do with limitation and boundaries was completely as if it didn't exist in the Or Ein Sof. And what filled the entire space that later would become the power of creation? Or Ein Sof, without any possibility of any definition, of any limitation, of any something. If so, you can't ask the question, how was the Or Ein Sof shining in these vessels? Those vessels were deep asleep. First of all, he says they're not even vessels. It's just a hidden potential power that's part of that's what we said earlier. Secondly, even if you were to call them a vessel, the vessels are not active. They're not pronounced. That you should wonder, how can these two things express themselves at the same time? But when it comes to the world of Atzilus, and we're analyzing a particular world of Atzilus, and over there you have vessels where the vessels of Atzilus are activated and are present and are showing themselves for who they are and what they are. And the oil of the energy flow that's flowing into them, which is their entire power. The vessels themselves are like a body without a soul. And the light that's showing in them is also expressed. If we were to argue that this light is Ein Sof, literally, and at the same time the vessels are being pronounced, that would be an impossibility. That would set off a clash that one has to go. You can't have both together. And obviously the infinite would win and the finite would dissolve. The fact that they don't dissolve, this is all a proof that the oil is also not fully infinite. That's the idea. V'gam, let's read over here at this point. V'gam bezeh, and also in this, when the Or Ein Sof abligul, when the infinite light that was shining before the tzimtzum, when that was present, the power of gvul, the power of limitation, was in utter shutdown. It was in complete self-effacement, as if it didn't exist. The kashem, just like she'acharat tzimtzum, and he compares it just like after the tzimtzum. When the tzimtzum enabled the power of the limiting power of God, which is what creates the shape and the form of the cosmos, and every boundary and every definition that exists within the world, all the walls and confinements that make up our existence, all the fences and definitions that characterize the world, that allow this all to come out. What happened to the infinite light? The infinite light goes into a state of non-expression. When the power of Gvul prevailed over the Bli Gvul, overpowered the Bli Gvul through the Tzimtzum. What did it do to the Bli Gvul? What did it do to the infinite? It shut it down completely, to the point that it's a non-persona, a non-reality, a non-factor. It's completely concealed. And the proof is, why? Even though the Or Ein Sof is present everywhere, mamish, literally, b'chol hachalal, in the entire empty space where the worlds are created, in the entire space of creation, ad lamata mata, all the way down, 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 the lei sasar panim minei, we say there's no place that is vacant of God. There's no place where God in his full presence is not. Hashem is everywhere. Nevertheless, he's not sensed at all. Ad, so much so, sheyesh madregas, to our levels, she'em bem gili Or Ein Sof klal, where there's no, see, at least in the higher worlds, there is a sense of some level of, some feeling of godliness. But over here, she'em bem gili Or Ein Sof klal, there's no revelation at all. Hainu she'en yoidim klal me'inyan elokus. They're so ignorant, they don't even know at all of the whole concept of godliness. So just like now, that's the state where the limitation has completely shut down the infinite. To make it like non-expressed, The same was also before the Tzimtzum. When the Oirein Soif was the dominating point, when the power of revelation was in full swing, it felt, but it filled. But when we say filled, it's different than after the Tzimtzum. It filled in a revealed way, in an open way, the entire empty space. The B'chol Chelkei HaCholol, in the what would later become the vacant space where the creations are planted, where the creations are positioned, in all this place, Haya Begilui Mamish was then in a revealed way. P'chenes ha'orein soif. The orein soif was fully manifest and fully revealed. Ayim Ashakasel Lakamun Perik Reish Ayin Gimel. Look later in chapter 230 and 73. We have a while till we get there, where this is explained. This is before the Tzimtzum. And therefore, since it's before the Tzimtzum, you can't ask the question, how can the light and the vessels be together? Because those vessels were completely, number one, those vessels are not real vessels, like we spoke earlier. They're not really limiting. They too are part of the infinity. Number two, they were silenced, they were muted. But if we to make the argument that after the Tzimtzum, where the vessels become already real vessels, and they're also in a state of expression, and yet at the same time we should allow light, infinite light, to come into them, that would mean to allow two opposites to work together. Hislapshus pnimi the orein soif. There should be an internal revelation of the orein soif, big kalim in vessels, sheheim bepchinas gvul, that which who are in a limited state, vishayifalu hagabala ba'or, and that these vessels should be able to take the light and limit it. Ba'atzilus, in Atzilus, v'chutz la'atzilus, and outside of Atzilus, like we discussed earlier, either to limit it in Atzilus to a certain degree, and to definitely limit the light, that it should be limited, that when it goes out of Atzilus, it should be limited. How can the two operate in unison at the same time? It's an inherent contradiction. And we have to say, and we have to say that the lights are now you might argue and say maybe the lights and Atzilus are not really revealed in the vessels. Maybe they just flood over the vessels, but they don't reveal themselves in the vessels. He says, no, but that's not what Pnimi means. Pnimi means that the light reveals it. Remember, we had a whole long, we have to take everybody back to all the way to the beginning of the Maayor, when we discussed how we gave the example of Or Pnimi, when we spoke about how lights are enclosed, how the soul is enclosed in the body. The same idea of how, just like the powers of the soul go into the limbs, and the light become totally one, because the light completely reveals itself in the limbs. So the same is also, he says, and the oiros of Atzilus are in an internal revealed state in the vessels. Commotion is Bar El, Perik Hey, and Vav, like chapter 5 and chapter 6 of the Maayor. And we actually see that. We see in every, the concept that there is light that goes into vessels is something we see everywhere. We see it in our own body. Our soul is enclosed in our body. We see it in all worlds, that energy gets contained in vessels. And that's all. Where does it originate? The concept of lights and going into a vessel is an Atzilus. So you see that the lights is contained by the vessel. And if the light would be infinite, it wouldn't be possible. That's the point. The emes, the truth, is visible on its own, that they're in a state of eslapshus pnimi. I'm sorry, I'm going a tiny bit over the regular time, where I try to keep it to 30 minutes, because I just want to finish the chapter, so I won't have to go over this tomorrow. And how can that be? The eich ef shaliyos, how can it be shebeguf, that in a body, shehu bepchinas gavul, that is in a state that is limited, yeh behislapshus, should be fully manifest and revealed in it, or habli gavul, a light that is infinite. That cannot be. This is the last line of chapter 12. So we have to say, Shegama Orda Atzilus, that the light of Atzilus is of a different quality light. It's not just the flow of the Orein Sof. It's not just the same Orein Sof flowing in Atzilus. That's not what it is. Shegama Orda Atzilus, even the light of Atzilus, remember the emphasis, the light, not just the vessels, Einoi Bepchinis Pshitus, are not with utter simplicity, and utterly limitless, because if that would be the case, the vessels they couldn't marry the vessels. Chulu. It wouldn't be a shidduch, it wouldn't be a proper thing. Okay. This concludes chapter 12. And tomorrow, Be'ez Hashem, we're going to do the Kitzer, and we're going to start chapter 13 on the Rebbe Rashab's birthday, which is going to be tomorrow. Be'ez Hashem.